Hello, welcome. Sorry. In this video, I'm discussing the anatomy and physiology of Omegaverse characters based on real-world biology. My name is Dr. Ferox. I'm a veterinarian with a lifelong fascination in both biology and fiction writing. So today I am blending the two. You can take ideas as they appeal and you can ignore the ones that you think are inconvenient. Realism can certainly enhance your world building because it helps to suspend disbelief if you haven't accidentally given your characters anatomy that should be lethal. But by all means, use the biology that lends itself to the story you want to write and the themes you want to explore. Whether you want high literature exploring the consequences of bioessentialism, or whether you're just writing PWP. Oh, and this could be a long video, so settle in and grab yourself a drink. Now, if you don't know what the Omegaverse is, you're in for a treat. But it's also your last chance to leave and carry on your life in ignorant bliss. Omegaverse is a writing trope where characters are designated as male or female, but also as either alpha, beta, or omega. Some worlds will scrap the betas entirely and just have alpha and omega, and some will have other letters of the alphabet, but that's easy to expand upon. In the context of Omegaverse, it is the omegas which get pregnant, particularly the male omegas. In some worlds, any female can also become pregnant, and in some worlds, alpha females are designated as infertile, but that depends upon the author. Characters will typically also have a whole host of animalistic features and behaviors, mostly but not exclusively borrowed from wolves. Now, before I go on, I do need to say that biological sex isn't really a binary in reality, nor is it the be-all and end-all of somebody's physical appearance or features or their role in society, unlike the Omegaverse. It's also worth mentioning that if you're looking at male pregnancy tropes, that trans men exist, and some of them will choose to get pregnant. There are also intersex humans, some of which identify as men and some of which don't, and some of them have a mix of features, and some of them can get pregnant. Biology is complicated at the best of times. I'm choosing to simplify it for fiction. I'm choosing not to talk about real people, and it is important to be considerate of people's real-world experiences. I also tend to use the term intersex when I'm talking about an individual person, and I keep the word hermaphrodite for talking about a species. So a species of plant or snail, for example, could be a hermaphrodite, but an individual person is not. So let's start at the smallest level, which is the chromosomes. Humans in this version of reality use X and Y chromosomes to predict sex, although it's not 100%. The human Y chromosome is tiny and it contains very few genes, one of which is the SRY gene, which switches on masculinity, essentially, by activating genes on other chromosomes. But this is not the only way to determine sex. In fact, across other species, it's not mandatory at all. Birds use ZW chromosomes, and they're switched. So it's female birds that have the two unmatched chromosomes, and males which have the matching pair. Other species might use temperature. Whatever base we're looking at, X and Y is not enough to determine the alpha or omega status in offspring. So we need something else. Now, our first option, in addition to the familiar X and Y, is to create A and O genes. This gives you the genotype AA for an alpha, OO for an omega, and the AO can either be a beta, or if you want to make one or the other more rare, you could say that, for example, the alpha gene is dominant to the omega, so this presents as an alpha, or you can reverse it and say omega is dominant, so this presents as an omega. This gives you 6 different genotypes for 6 different phenotypes, although you could still get some individual variations. For example, a alpha Klinefelters could be AAXXY. You could also easily swap an AO chromosome for an autosome and just let it be an autosomal gene instead of an extra sex chromosome. Now, there are a couple of world-building consequences if you use this chromosome system. Firstly, the inheritance pattern is very predictable. If you cross alpha to alpha, you will only get alpha offspring. If you cross omega to omega, you only get omega offspring. If you cross alpha to omega, you only get AO offspring, which are either betas, if you are using that, or they are whichever is dominant. It also means if you cross a alpha male to an omega male, you will have reduced fertility because any embryo that inherits 2 Y chromosomes and no X chromosome is not viable under current human biology. There's also the possibility in a modern setting to have a genetic or chromosomal test, which means alpha and omega status can be determined in utero. And if you're in the sort of world or dystopia where omegas or alphas are persecuted against, suddenly they are being detected before they are born, and that might make them a whole lot more rare than they would otherwise be. But if you don't like the chromosome system, perhaps epigenetics would be more your style. So what are epigenetics? They are things that are not genes, but things that influence how genes are read or expressed by the organism. For example, our local friend and resident dog food ingredient, the crocodile, uses temperature to determine the sex of their offspring. Now, that's a little bit harder to do in a warm-blooded mammal, as most humanoid characters are going to be. But you could have it happen, for example, with a heat wave or cold snap that has influenced the number of, for example, omegas born the following season. Or possibly a fever running through the population increased the body temperature of the gestational parents at a critical period of development that changed the ratios that were born the following year. Next down the list we have nutrition, with our friends the bees being an example. They will feed royal jelly to particular larvae to create queens out of some of them, but not all of them. You could do the same thing with alphas or omegas. And if this wasn't a known factor, for example, changing diets with the Industrial Revolution, you might accidentally end up with a population deficient in one or the other. It also gives you the possibility to try to deliberately induce alpha or omega status in offspring, which is a whole plot device that you're welcome to use. You could also go with the local pheromone climate, which is a way of saying the more alpha pheromones around, the more likely that fetus will develop into an omega, or vice versa. This could be a perfectly normal biological mechanism to keep the population in roughly 50-50 ratios. All of these epigenetic factors open up the possibility to a set of identical twins, or even clones, having different alpha or omega status. They also open up the possibility in fiction of a character trying to influence the alpha omega status of their own offspring or the offspring of somebody else, which sounds like the kind of thing royalty might do, but also opens up the darker possibilities to being a mechanism to subjugate an entire class. Yet another possibility for determining alpha or omega status is simply sequential, like our friends the clownfish that switch from one sex to another with age. Switching from alpha to omega status might simply be a factor of age. It could also be a factor of nutrition, or particular periods of stress might cause them to switch from one to another. Or possibly they might just switch with seasons, going from rut to heat every 3 to 6 months, depending on your world building. Now, whatever trigger you choose in this version of biology, consider the social implications of that world building. For example, if stress is a trigger, does that mean that everybody who does a stint in the army comes back as an alpha? Do people from poorer socioeconomic neighbourhoods have a higher incidence of being an alpha? Are there overzealous parents that are deliberately stressing out their kids in order to induce alpha status? And what about for omegas? Can they be induced? Can you perhaps envision a darker plotline where a villain is kidnapping people and trying to induce omega status in those victims? And then what sort of real-world issue does that kind of conversion camp remind you of? That's getting a little bit dark and heavy and a little too close to queer theory for this video. But if that's the story you want to write, go ahead. You're the author. Moving on, we still need a plausible system to get these male omegas pregnant. So if we have 6 hypothetical phenotypes, how do we maximize the combinations for who can get pregnant and who they get pregnant by? For literary reasons. Humans typically have either eggs, a large stationary gamete, or sperm, a small mobile gamete. And you can do that if you want to. It's been a very successful system across evolution. You could even have phenotypes like the alpha female or the omega male be true hermaphrodites, producing both eggs and sperm in separate gonads. This does mean they could potentially self-fertilize with the turkey baster method. But if you want a system that lets any of the 4 phenotypes with wombs get pregnant by anything else, consider instead amoeboid gametes. Now, having one big cell that carries all the mitochondria and the cellular machinery be visited by one little cell, which is basically just a nucleus strapped to a rocket, isn't the only way to get 2 haploid cells to intermingle. Haploid meaning cells that contain half the total DNA required to grow an organism. Instead, we could have 2 gametes that are equal in size and cellular contributions, both moving very slowly towards each other. As a consequence of this, the ejaculate from the inseminating partner needs to be deposited physically closer to where the gamete of the gestational partner is going to be. Good thing alphas are pretty well renowned for their extended delivery device. Another consequence is that the 2 phenotypes which can both inseminate and carry a pregnancy, alpha female and omega male, only need one gonad, and you can put that internally or externally, wherever it suits. They will require a biomechanism to prevent them self-fertilizing. You could use a lock and key type mechanism where cells have to have a different binder on the surface, so they won't bind with their essentially own gametes. It might potentially mean that this species is more prone to teratomas or molar pregnancy, and you Google pictures of those at your own risk. One option for a biological mechanism to prevent self-fertilization is a lock and key mechanism, where cells that have a matching lock and key can't fertilize, but cells with different locks and keys still can. Another option is that instead of individual gametes, gametes get stored in packages with guard cells of either a seeker type or a defender type. Instead of semen containing billions and billions of sperm, it instead contains perhaps just thousands or millions of these seeker capsules, which are biochemically drawn towards the defender cells. Once the guard cells of either type are engaged in opening up channels, our 2 gametes can meet and unite. These defender cells probably have a secondary job of ensuring the environment inside is nutrient-rich for that gamete and any developing embryo, and may also serve a function in suppressing the development of other gametes in order to reduce the risk of twins or higher-order multiple births. And as a fun literary detail, because these seeker capsules are a lot bigger than a single sperm cell, it does mean alpha semen probably has a much grittier texture than one might expect. This allows your alpha female or omega male to only need one type of gonad, and they may produce both seekers and defenders either at the same time or alternating, depending on whether they're in heat, in rut, or of course, the plot. Having just one type of gamete and one type of gonad means we've now done away with the alpha-female fertility problem. It also means that we can place the omega male's gonads wherever we like, internally or externally. Strictly speaking, it also doesn't matter where you place the alpha male's gonads. There's no reason they have to be outside the body anymore, unless you want it as some sort of social or dominance display. In a default human, testicles need to be on the outside of the body in order to be fertile, because sperm does not like to be produced at the normal human body temperature. So if you had an alpha female with internal testes, her sperm count is going to be really subpar, unless you've just hand-waved all of that biology for your story. Oh, and if you're using these amoeboid gametes, it does mean both parents have contributed mitochondrial DNA, which is important if you're doing any sort of plot line with DNA tracking or identification, and you no longer have that Daughters of Eve scenario where you can track back the matrilineal line. Now, at this point in the world building, I've got to ask, does gender even matter anymore? We've got 6 potential phenotypes, 4 of which can get pregnant, 4 of which can get somebody else pregnant, and 2 of which might be able to do both. And all of these phenotypes come with associated behaviors and social roles in this bioessentialist world that gets built. So do just 2 genders work in this world? I'm inclined to say no, even if you squint. But that is beyond the scope of this video, because gender is not biology. It's a social construct. And the Omegaverse is a fun literary framework with which you can explore it. If you want to. It's your story. Now I have to question how heterosexuality works in the Omegaverse, because something like an alpha male, omega female pairing certainly feels very heterosexual because of all the different phenotypes. They're definitely opposite each other. But technically alpha female, male omega is also opposite each other, and that does not feel heterosexual in the same way. Something to think about anyway. It's all fiction, it's all fantasy. Use the biological configuration that lends itself to the story you want to write. But think about the consequences of that biology. Are there social pressures determining what sort of couplings are acceptable or desirable? Can 2 alpha males get married, for example, even though they won't produce offspring in normal situations? Or is it just a preference thing? Can a beta not adequately accommodate the size of an alpha, leading to a rather unsatisfying encounter for that alpha and a potentially downright painful one for the beta? Conversely, can a beta just not satisfy an omega? Is this why alphas and omegas are drawn to each other? Does the heart's desire not match the groin's requirements? This physical preference may also correlate with optimal fertility. Perhaps a beta male just can't penetrate deep enough to fertilize an omega, while the alpha can, at least in worlds that haven't yet invented reproductive medicine or the turkey baster. Genitals within a species often do have a sort of lock and key arrangement, and for a real-world example, I refer you to our friend, the anableps. These fish, commonly called the four-eyed fish, also have 4 genders. There are male and female fish, which is typical, but their genital arrangement is such that they also either have a left-handed or right-handed arrangement. A left-handed male can only mate with a right-handed female and vice versa. So there are 4 possible genital arrangements, but each individual fish can only copulate successfully with one kind. And of course, if you're writing in a modern setting, then assisted reproductive technologies allowed for conception between a wide range of couples, if you're more interested in the actual baby than their baby making. Anyway, whatever genetic and cellular arrangement you've chosen for your world building, let's move on to some physiology that applies to everyone. Now, before talking about pheromones and scent glands and heat and rut, I need to talk about a couple of biological concepts. You need to know what's normal so that you can mess with it. Homeostasis is a mostly automatic process that living things use to keep their internal conditions relatively constant, or at least within a normal set of parameters. It includes things like your core body temperature, salt levels, and blood pressure. Most of these processes are automatic. For example, if you get too hot, you're going to start to sweat. And if you get too cold, you're going to start to shiver. But there are also behavioral components. If you're too hot, you're going to sweat, but you're also probably going to take off your coat. If you're too cold, you're going to shiver, but you're probably also going to try to go somewhere warmer. Mostly this happens with a series of negative feedback loops. What that means is that once a parameter has gone out of its target range, the opposite system will activate to bring it back around. One of the easiest examples to understand is your blood glucose. Normally, your glucose should be regulated by insulin and glucagon. If your blood glucose is too high, insulin helps lower it and push it into your cells. If your glucose is too low, glucagon helps to release it from stores in your body. But your secondary behavioral response is that you will want food. These systems are referred to as negative feedback loops because once a parameter moves too far in one direction, it is the opposite system that activates to reverse it. The rarer situation is a positive feedback loop. In this situation, once something starts happening, its feedback loop causes it to continue to happen, often with greater strength, frequency, and intensity. A positive feedback loop is mostly used by the reproductive system, the classical example being contractions while giving birth. But it is also used for other shorter-term events that require rapid growth of an organ or expulsion of genetic material. Why is this relevant for Omegaverse? Why, for inducing those reproductive events you're also fond of writing about. But it is also relevant for heat cycles and rut. But first, let's talk a bit about pheromones. Humans do have pheromones. Science has been able to find and identify them in assorted bodily secretions, though we pick up on them in a subliminal at best manner. If you do happen to find someone with pheromones you like, enjoy that experience. Pheromones carry information about all sorts of things, mostly reproductive status, but also potentially health, nutrition, and maybe even mood. While there's some debate about whether humans notice pheromones or not, we definitely produce them. They are measurable. And there are lots of anecdotal stories, particularly from waitresses or from certain female performers, that will report much higher tips when they're approaching their estrus than when they are not. In my personal experience, I went through an IVF cycle and I was hyperovulating. So I had about 20 egg follicles ready to go instead of the normal 1 to 2. In my day job, I'm a veterinarian, and every single canine patient for 4 days when I was due to ovulate would walk straight into my consult room and make a beeline to stick their nose in my crotch. It was embarrassing for me. It was embarrassing for the pet owners that would say things like, "Oh, he never normally does that." And it was a very obvious pheromone effect. In the animal kingdom, humans are notoriously bad at detecting pheromones and scents in general, particularly compared to canines. But if you want to play around with pheromones in your writing, your alphas and omegas need to be much better at detecting these, whether that is consciously or subliminally. Most animals use a vomeronasal organ for detecting pheromones, which is like a little sensory nub that sits between the nasal cavity and the mouth, in the roof of the mouth. It's just behind your front teeth. So if you put a finger onto the roof of your mouth, about there, that's where it should be. In humans, this is probably vestigial at best, and it gets debated every now and then. Some of us probably have some ability to use it, but it's most likely kind of like wisdom teeth. It might have a little bit of function, but it's not really critical. Some of us might have better ones than others, but if it's not causing a problem, medical science isn't terribly fussed about it. If your alphas and omegas are going to be driven wild by pheromones, they probably need a functional vomeronasal organ. Now, admittedly, you are probably not going to write about the finer points of mouth and nasal anatomy in your stories, but there are a couple of behaviours that come along with having such an organ. Firstly, moist surfaces will absorb and detect pheromones better. So that might present as just licking the upper lip, whether that's a conscious behaviour or not. Another is the very classic phlegmon response, which lots of animals exhibit, where they sort of lift their upper lip and inhale sharply to direct air up towards the top of the mouth. Interestingly, elephants will sometimes touch surfaces with their trunk and then directly transfer whatever they've touched to the roof of their mouth in order to detect pheromones. And there's no reason a humanoid character can't do exactly the same thing with their fingers. So what would human pheromones smell like? Most likely a musky or a sweaty type of odour. But as we pick up on them in a largely subliminal way, you have a fair amount of artistic license describing what they smell like. Though that said, when you do have people who are attracted to each other, they would typically describe those pheromones as delicious. So for literary applications, how would an alpha or an omega who just wants to get on with their life without needing to bone from Friday through Tuesday go about blocking these pheromones? Broadly speaking, you either block the production of pheromones or you block the detection of pheromones. And presumably alphas and omegas both produce and detect them, so this could apply to both. On the detecting end, perhaps your alpha character just doesn't want to be distracted by pheromones right now. Maybe there's a critical mission or an important business meeting or something else that requires their attention. How would they go about reducing their sensitivity to pheromones? Option 1 is flooding or masking it with something else. You can only fit so many scents or pheromones into a vomeronasal organ. You're just trying to dilute out the concerning pheromones. Strong scents like coffee or mint would potentially be good candidates, or even chili, although that might also be uncomfortable. Or you could also consider something like lavender essential oil, though that is not intended for direct consumption or sniffing, and your character may end up feeling quite unwell if they try this home remedy. Rotting meat also has a lingering smell that may distract from any other pheromones, although your character may not be entirely happy about it. And although not usually recommended for anything, cigarettes might be a good option because not only do they have a lingering smell of their own, they typically reduce the smoker's sensitivity to other scents. Option 2 is deliberately seeking out a viral illness. Having a nose full of mucus is generally not something you want to seek out, but an alpha might find it desirable in certain circumstances so that they physically cannot detect an omega's pheromones. As a side note, COVID-19 was also notorious for deactivating a sufferer's sense of smell. It may also render you unable to detect pheromones for a while. Option 3 is surrounding yourself with competitive pheromones. If you're an alpha who doesn't want to be distracted by an omega, then surround yourself with alpha pheromones until that's all you notice and your physiology becomes disinterested. Now, typically, the most reliable turn-off pheromones are going to be from those that are closely related to your character, which usually means parents or siblings. It's quite possible that living at home or visiting home, which is a location filled with those parents' pheromones, provides an easy way to suppress arousal, which does mean it's quite plausible that alphas have somewhere in their home a double-bagged pair of their parents' dirty socks labeled sniff in case of horny emergency in order to turn off their own arousal. And in a practical sense, unless your alpha and omega characters are going into puberty much later than the puberty for their default gender, you want a mechanism with which to suppress their heat or their rut. Because some kids go through puberty earlier than the age of 11, and we don't really want an insatiable omega heat in an 11-year-old. They're not physically mature enough to handle a pregnancy, especially with some of the creative ways that a male omega pregnancy could happen. So it makes sense from a societal and an evolutionary standpoint that there is a biological mechanism to suppress the coming on of heats. And the simplest one is the presence of parental pheromones, particularly if those parents are still at a reproductive age. And there's plenty of precedence for that in the animal kingdom anyway. And if there is a natural mechanism in place to suppress heat or rut, that means that for you as an author, there is also a method with which to screw with it. Consider characters moving out of home for the first time, possibly into a dormitory type situation where there's suddenly a whole bunch of new people living together. What happens then when there's no pheromone regulation? What happens in group housing situations? Or prisons? Does the prison flood the chambers with distinctly unappealing pheromones, trying to suppress everybody? Does the presence of a potent enough alpha suppress other alphas in nearby proximity? And what about omegas? Will they sync up their heat cycles if they're living together, just like humans sometimes sync up their menstrual cycles living together? But how might one go about blocking their own pheromone secretion? Perhaps your omega just wants to have one single weekend in peace. Or perhaps their omega status is still a secret and they don't want to be discovered. How could they go about blocking their own pheromone production? Well, they could also attempt to cover them up with strong smells like cigarettes or coffee or menthol, or potentially artificial alpha pheromones. They might also have technology such as enzymatic deodorants or creams that they use to break down the pheromones before they evaporate off the skin. Possibly a non-permeable bandage would be a very short-term solution to physically block pheromones from leaving the skin. For example, there is a tattoo bandage called second skin, which doesn't allow things to pass through it. If that is wrapped over scent glands, they are probably not exuding anything that gets off the skin. This is a really temporary solution because you're going to accumulate a lot of sweat underneath. But in a pinch, you could also use cling wrap as a physical barrier preventing the release of those pheromones. I'm not saying it's going to work perfectly, of course. Isn't the point of a story to have conflict in it? And isn't the point of understanding the pheromone system so that you can break it down at inconvenient moments? As a fun physiology fact, scent glands are typically modified sweat glands. So anything that reduces your character's sweating might also reduce their ability to produce scents or pheromones. Being physically really, really cold would reduce sweating and might reduce the amount of scent or pheromones they're putting out. Medications like Botox are well known to prevent sweating and may also prevent the production of scent or pheromones, at least temporarily. Really potent medications like isotretinoin also can be used to prevent sweating permanently and might also be used to prevent the production of pheromones permanently. But that one in particular has potentially really nasty side effects, including stopping the secretion of dog damn everything, which means, in particular, lots of gastric disturbances, but also your male omegas probably won't produce slick anymore. Now, straight up neutering or hormonal suppressants are probably preferable to that kind of drug, because even if you only have a temporary version, you're going to have a bunch of uncomfortable side effects. But which areas of the body are more likely to contain scent glands and thus produce higher concentrations of pheromones? Default humans are certainly less sensitive to scents, but definitely not immune. And our society tends to downplay body odors and encourage personal hygiene. This may not strictly be the case in an Omegaverse society. So the obvious candidates for scent gland location are the regions we already know are smelly: the armpit, the groin, the genital, and the anal region. Scent glands are basically modified sweat glands, so any region of the body that sweats a lot is a good candidate to have a scent gland in it. So palms of the hands or the feet might also have scent glands. And as an added feature of this, it means that your character will be leaving pheromones behind on anything they walk on barefoot or anything they touch. A third option would be saying your scent glands are in locations where we would typically apply perfume, so the wrists or onto the neck. This is because there's good blood supply there, so the regions are typically warm, which makes the perfume or the scent evaporate into the air more easily. But this is really based on our social convention and not based on biology as such. Now, science has identified some pheromones in human vaginal fluid, so it is quite likely that pheromones would be present in slick as well. And it's plausible that scent glands are something of a erogenous zone, as many species with scent glands seem to enjoy being touched around them. Perhaps a subliminal and vestigial sensitivity to pheromones is why some people are so keen on playing with the feet of other people, or why there's such a market for gently used undergarments in our world. In your Omegaverse, where sensitivity to pheromones is active and not vestigial, that may not be so much of a kink, but more of a mainstream behaviour. Note that canids and other carnivores do have scent glands in their anal sacs. Do whatever you want in fiction, but I don't recommend you inflict your humanoid characters with this particular anatomical feature. They are messy and stinky and they can take a little bit of maintenance, but also they are prone to spontaneously release when that individual is either startled or scared or stressed or sometimes just extremely relaxed. This makes things a lot more awkward, it makes practical jokes a lot less fun, and it increases the laundry bill. Which brings us to marking, which Dingus is demonstrating for us. If your alpha and omega are all hyped up on pheromones, they might start out gently rubbing their scent glands on each other, but that could well progress to a little nibble or a chomp. If marking their partner this way, they are more likely to bite somewhere fleshy and accessible. And as pheromones are reported to be delicious, according to those who enjoy them, they may well be biting over a scent gland. After all, one does typically prefer to bite things that are both satisfying to get your teeth into and smell delicious. Now, biting the hands or the feet are probably too bony to be really satisfying. And biting an armpit is really just difficult, especially in the throes of passion. But biting the nearby top of the shoulder or the neck is certainly more plausible and probably more satisfying. And it does have a certain literary appeal, which raises a question. If your alpha or omega bites into a region containing a scent gland to mark their partner, does the bruising or the bleeding subsequently change the pheromones that are produced? Because due to inflammation and various cytokines, this is actually plausible. You could say that marking is just a purely visual signal respected by other alphas out of courtesy to each other. Or you could say there is actually a biological change. Bruising the scent gland could change the pheromone signal from available to taken, which opens up a whole realm of possibilities with accidental injuries changing an omega's signaling. An omega with taken pheromones might be less desirable in general to any passing alpha, but this could be bypassed with cognitive desires or willpower, or for literary reasons, spite. This also raises the question as to whether tattooing or dry needling would change an omega's pheromones to be taken, and whether this is then used temporarily to make them less interesting to passing alphas or not. As previously mentioned, there are typically scent glands and pheromone production in the anogenital region. And while your alphas could bite omegas there to mark them, it's a less visually obvious location, and it's also possible that normal mating proclivities will adequately bruise the region to change the pheromones, particularly if there's a knot involvement. And as a side note, if your Omegaverse characters are so in tune with pheromones, they probably notice pheromones from their offspring. Whether their baby's pheromones acts as a heat suppressant or whether it's just part of pack bonding, that's a world-building question for you to consider. Now that we've covered some general features that could apply to everybody in your Omegaverse, let's narrow in on the individual phenotypes, starting, of course, alphabetically. For each phenotype, I'm going to talk about both form and function. Within the bioessentialist trope that Omegaverse so often utilizes, alphas are characterized by a cluster of behaviors including aggression, assertiveness, and territorial behaviors. These are social behaviors, world-building decisions, which are not the purview of this video. I'm just focusing on what they build and how they function. For both male and female alphas, their unifying feature is that they both have a genetic material delivery mechanism. And I have been racking my brain trying to figure out how to keep this topic within YouTube's community standards. And my conclusion is that I'm just going to fail. Both male and female alphas may be written as having a phallus and being capable of inseminating. For a male alpha, that's pretty straightforward to conceptualize. It's more or less what a typical cis man in our universe would have. Oh, who am I kidding? It's definitely not less. But the basic layout is all there, typically with the addition of the notorious knot. This does mean that at birth and in utero, your male alpha and male beta may actually be indistinguishable from each other, at least until their first arousal incident. You may or may not decide that this is the same as the presenting trope, but either way, I assume that the individual knows their status before it is announced to the rest of the world. The knot is analogous to the bulbus glandus in canines, and that's straight up where this anatomical feature was lifted from. It's not overly complicated, it's just a slightly different shape at the base of the phallus, which will engorge with blood like the rest of the organ. The knot at the base of the phallus lines up with the entrance to the receiving partner's own reproductive tract. The function of the knot is to tie the mated pair together, keeping them in physical proximity for longer in order to prevent mating by arrival. In your Omegaverse, you might decide that this serves a slightly different purpose, and as an added bonus, if you chose to run with amoeboid gametes, it keeps all the relevant anatomy interlinked for longer to allow the transfer of those slightly slower gametes. But canines have another feature that humans don't have, the baculum, which is a bone contained within the phallus, sometimes called the os penis. Humans don't have one, and you probably don't want your Omegaverse characters to have one either, because while it does allow for a more rapid erection, it does limit some of the positional flexibility that your characters may have otherwise enjoyed. There are, broadly speaking, two very common styles of penis construction within mammal species. The first, of which you are probably more familiar, is the musculo-cavernous type penis, which mostly achieves erection by filling with blood. While the finer points of histology are probably not relevant to your writing, this type of penis gains both length and width as it engorges, and it will take multiple heartbeats or pulses to do so because it is physically filling with blood. A baculum would reduce the volume of blood you needed to fill that phallus, but then you'd have to hide another whole bone somewhere in the abdominal cavity of the female alpha. The second type, fibroelastic penises, do not gain any width or length with erection, so they are likely less suitable for your fiction. But they do require a muscular movement to get it up. This is much faster, but probably less satisfying. Compare the filling of this glass with fluid, which physically takes time, to the single muscular movement required to extend this toy. Both will achieve their purpose, but at different speeds. Now, one erection-related anatomical feature from the fibroelastic penis that might be particularly relevant to the female alpha is the sigmoid flexure. Ruminants, where this anatomy comes from, has a S-shaped curve partway along the length of the phallus, and when a particular muscle contracts, it straightens the S shape, causing that phallus to extend and pop out of the sheath where it was hidden. It's plausible that the female alpha has a hybrid arrangement where she has a fibroelastic member on the inside of her abdomen and a musculocavernous segment that she can extend as required, which means that with a voluntary muscular movement, she can pop out herself and then maintain the erection in a musculocavernous and more satisfying way once doing so. And naturally, if it's a voluntary muscular movement to allow her to extend her member at will, she can also at least attempt to withdraw it at will, but that will be harder if she is engorged. Now, I like the hybrid arrangement because even for your most ambitious literature, the female alpha does not require the additional girth on the portion of her phallus which is inside her abdomen. It's only relevant for the sticking out bits. And her abdomen is going to be crowded enough if you're going to make her capable of both getting pregnant and causing pregnancy. From a writer's perspective, this looks like a sort of typical external features, but then popping out a member either at will or with partial arousal, but being unable to withdraw it while engorgement persists. Now, there is an evolutionary theory that humans lost their baculum as a type of performance indicator. And there's nothing wrong with this. But if there is a particularly large organ to fill, that blood has to come from somewhere. Your amorous alphas may divert blood from their guts for a short period of time for their activities. And if you've decided that being in rut makes them lose interest in food, that totally makes sense. If you need a lot more blood flow than that, you start looking at whether you're taking it from the brain, and that's not compatible with consciousness or having a good time. And let's be clear, I am talking about some of those 12-inch members that some of you authors dutifully insist upon writing. And while most people remain fairly functional with some moderate blood diversion, expecting your alphas to maintain that erect volume and be athletic and occasionally articulate while doing so is probably just a little unreasonable. Unless, of course, you also increase their blood volume during rut. Perhaps alphas going into rut are also said to be glowing, the way pregnant humans are often described because of their increased blood volume. The less glamorous side effect of this being more prone to nosebleeds. Oh, and if you have decided that your Omegaverse characters are induced ovulators like cats, be aware that cats have barbed phalluses. Not only does this likely make things more painful for the receiving partner, particularly if they're creating butt babies, although admittedly consenting adults are into whatever they're into, it does make things like prophylactic condoms a unique challenge. And this opens up an interesting literary parallel between your alphas, who are unable to use condoms because of the barbs on their penis, and gay men in AIDS panic. So maybe just have a think about the world-building implications of that and potential stigmas and perceived concerns, and probably get your queer theory from somebody who's much more educated in the topic than I am. But stepping back from that sociology tangent, let's go back to the female alpha and reconsider her anatomy if you want her to function like a true hermaphrodite. And very briefly, when describing anatomy, I tend to describe the position of one organ relative to the other organs. So anterior is towards the front, or the belly button, in a standing humanoid, and posterior is towards the rear, or the back end. Medial is towards the center, or the midline, and lateral is towards the outside. Your first option is to borrow from our friend, the hyena. She has a fairly unique anatomy, which at a glance can be mistaken for male, and this is because her clitoris is extended and contains both her urethra and her birth canal. It is a unique arrangement, but obviously a viable one. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any little hyenas. You would need to modify your female alphas with a few additional glands along the way if you want to borrow this anatomy in order to produce a suitable volume of ejaculate and decide whether she alternates from contributing to receiving genetic material or whether she is capable of both at the same time. Now, in a humanoid, there is a distinct disadvantage to getting pregnant with that anatomical arrangement, and that is that our offspring have incredibly large heads. And giving birth to a human child through what is functionally a penis is going to be uncomfortable for everyone. So if you choose this anatomy borrowed from the hyenas for your female alpha, you may decide that although they can technically get pregnant, they generally don't want to. If you are using a hyena-based model, to avoid the need to give birth to a human through a phallus, let's say that the posterior aspect of that phallus wall thins and fuses with the more traditional birth canal as birth approaches, leaving just one wider passage for that offspring to pass through. Another option is to borrow from more marsupial anatomy, which can have anywhere up to 3 vaginas, one in the middle for genetic material or offspring to come out, and the 2 lateral ones for genetic material coming in. Now, if you put the phallus and its pipe in the anterior wall of the vagina or in front, then when it's engorged, it will partially compress the vaginal canal, diverting incoming fluids to the lateral sides. This convoluted mechanism would allow both the giving and receiving of genetic material at the same time. In this diagram, I combined the idea of the sigmoid flexure and used a single gonad capable of making both donating and receiving gametes. But you could easily modify this based on the type of rules that you want to use. This way, when not in use, the phallus can be mostly retracted back into the abdomen, but part of it will remain in the vaginal wall where it can receive sensation. Meanwhile, the rest of the anatomy can still receive and incubate genetic material like the default cis woman anatomy in our universe. To make some room in there, the pregnant female alpha either needs her phallus to atrophy or shrink somewhat, or withdraw further into the abdomen in order to make room for the growing fetus. But that's well within the bounds of weird things pregnancy can do to a body. If her phallus is mostly musculocavernous on the external fragment, then that's achievable just by shrinking the blood vessels and in the short term and squishing down the spongy tissue. It does mean that pregnant female alphas probably can't maintain an erection in late pregnancy, possibly not for a month or two after. But would they really want to at the time? Personally, I consider the 2 to 3 month lack of erection as a reasonable compromise for not having to give birth through a penis. Oh, and if you place the phallus on the anterior side of the vagina, it is quite possible that 2 female alphas could fertilize each other at the same time, assuming that you're using the rules where they can both give and receive gametes. It might be a little technically difficult, but with a bit of practice, it should be quite doable. On the other hand, if you place your female alpha's phallus on the posterior wall of the vagina, then when she has an erection coming forward, it's going to close off her own vulva. This means that 2 female alphas cannot get each other pregnant at the same time. The ladies are going to have to take turns. That might also theoretically make it possible to self-copulate, though I would not expect that to be a common occurrence. It also seems probable that a female alpha would not appreciate being mated by a male alpha due to the volume of organs present in her pelvic canal. Just a bit crowded, but then again, maybe an individual is into that. You're the author. Now, If your female alphas are producing two types of gametes, that is those that give and receive, or eggs and sperm, from just one gonad, there is a risk of self-fertilization. They may also be more prone to twins in this scenario, or multiple births, because no biological system is perfect. But you're the author, that's your choice. As the author, you also need to decide whether your female alphas have internal gonads or not. If she produces sperm, human sperm do not like to live at normal human body temperature. It reduces their fertility. So do her gonads descend out of her body when she comes into rut, or does it just not matter, like birds do? Does a predictable drop in body temperature signal that a rut is imminent? And would this perhaps be masked by a temporary fever? You should also give some thought as to where her urethra goes. The urinary bladder is typically anterior to all of the reproductive tract, which means whatever pipes you put in front is what that bladder is going to connect to. If the phallus is anterior, then she wheezes through her phallus. If the vaginal wall is anterior, then she wheezes through her vaginal wall, where her urethra drains. If you're going with the wall of the phallus breaks down and connects to the vagina at the time of giving birth, then that style of female alpha will temporarily pee through her vagina after giving birth. Now, having both a phallus and a vaginal tract means that this style of female alphas are identifiable at birth, or potentially at prenatal ultrasounds, if that technology exists in your world. It's then a world-building question as to whether they are discriminated against, and whether things like selective abortions take place, or whether routine infanticide is present in your world, or even whether surgical modifications would take place for these not necessarily wanted infants. And that brings you really close to the real-world topic of female genital mutilation. So think carefully about what sort of impacts that might have on your world. And now that we have discussed cocks at length, it is worth briefly mentioning testicles, because the size of testicles do not actually correlate to the size of a phallus. In primates, they actually correlate to rates of monogamy. Primate species which genuinely pair bond tend to have smaller testes relative to the rest of their anatomy than species that don't. So if your Omegaverse features genuine unbreakable pair bonds, i.e. magic monogamy, the size of their testes may actually be quite modest. Most semen volume comes from assorted glandular secretions, so having a relatively modest set of testicles will not prevent your alpha from producing suitably generous quantities of semen. If they are a voluminous species, they are more likely to have a very large prostate. So do with that information what you will. These are the sorts of choices that you get to make as an author. So pick and choose the biology that lends itself to the story you want to write. There's a lot of potential material there if you wanted to write about the angst of infertility that's forced upon you, or stepping outside of your assigned gender roles in a bioessentialist society. And if you're just writing PWP, you can choose whichever combination of innies, outies, and squishy bits lend themselves to your secondary kinks. But please be aware that you might hit a nerve if you start characterizing all of your female alphas as masculine women and use them as a direct allegory for trans women, and then start characterizing them all as being more aggressive in their amorous activities, particularly if you choose to also combine that with infertility. There's a lot of potentially unpleasant tropes that you might hit on, and you should consider being open to feedback from somebody with more experience and knowledge on the topic. Bioessentialism in reality isn't actually any good for anybody, but Omegaverse lets us play with it in a more detached way. Just try to be considerate of other people's real-world experiences. Write all the messy fiction that you want, but consider exploring some of those implications and just being tactful about the lives that other people live. Oh, and tag your poor stories accurately, of course. Now, many authors choose to put their alphas into a rut, which complements the omega's heat. But what is a rut exactly? Because it's more than feeling just a little bit frisky. Ruts are typically a feature of ruminant species, which are prey. It's the same as saying they're in breeding season. Ruts are typically associated with territorial behavior and aggression, as all the males of the species would go into rut at the same time. And that time is typically one pregnancy length before the optimal time of year to be born. Your alphas may not be seasonal breeders, as default humans typically aren't, which is probably an evolutionary factor because if most of the adult population was pregnant at the same time, there's about 3 months of the year where basically nothing is going to get done, and that would be an evolutionary disadvantage. But if all of your world's alphas do rut at the same time, I'm going to suggest that schools are closed for that season because no high school teacher gets paid enough to deal with that. Some delightful animal behaviors associated with being in rut include various display behaviors, which do vary between species, but might include scenting, anointing themselves with extra pungent odors. Some ruminants insist on peeing on their own feet, and often they will bellow very loudly about how totally bangable they are. Whether you, as the author, would find these sorts of behaviours endearing or not is totally up to you, completely a world-building decision. But I wouldn't be surprised at all to find out there is some sort of alpha display behaviour associated with being in rut. What that is up to you. That is a world-building decision. I'm going to talk about how ruts are triggered and ended for literary reasons, because that's what you want to know as an author, isn't it? How might a rut be accidentally triggered or induced, or how might a character go about trying to prevent their rut from happening? In nature, there are a few mechanisms that can signal that it is time to rut. One is said to be daylight length, but it's probably more accurate to say it's the number of hours of uninterrupted darkness. This is usually used for seasonally breeding species, as the season would determine the length of the night. We can manipulate this, and we do so deliberately in racehorses to bring them into season early so their birthdays are as early as possible, for gambling reasons. We do it by confining the mares under bright lights for a couple of extra hours at night so that they think the night is shorter. You can achieve a similar result by just adding 1 extra hour of light into the middle of the night. Now translate that sort of physiology into our modern lives. How many of you right now are staring at artificial lights in the middle of the night? If your characters do that too often, their seasonal triggers are going to be all over the place, and suddenly the body thinks it's breeding season. It's also possible that in a modern setting, absolutely nobody has their seasonal triggers in order, which means there's almost certainly some con man going around selling special light bulbs in order to correct this effect. Or, as the author, you might decide that it's actually longer nights, not shorter nights, that is the seasonal trigger for rut, which means that a prolonged blackout or a digital detox might suddenly be causing randy chaos. Another feature of the rut is that rutting males generally perform better, as in father more offspring, if they are carrying a little extra body fat at the start of their breeding season. This is because they're ruminants, and the way ruminants feed is that they chew their food twice. Once when they eat it, and the second time when they regurgitate it to chew the cud. And that, naturally, takes time. In their breeding season, these males are spending so much time courting and copulating that there just aren't enough hours in the day for them to chew their food twice. Coupled with the fact that they're generally performing vigorous activities, means that rutting ruminants typically lose a lot of weight in their breeding season. This is best studied in domestic species because there are profit motives to efficiency, and the general consensus is that the optimal male will start his breeding season overweight and will end it just a little underweight. Translating that to a humanoid alpha would mean that the optimal body condition to start a rut is basically bare. As such, it's plausible that a rising plane of nutrition, which is a fancy way of saying eating more calories every day, could be an effective way to trigger a rut. Now, for a species or a society which evolved eating mostly seasonal foods, this kind of makes sense. If your harvests are most bountiful in autumn, then 9 months later your offspring are born in summer. And 3 months after that, when they're just starting to be interested in solid food, you're back around to autumn when you've got plenty of it. But if you're in a modern world where calories are cheap and there's a McDonald's on every corner, ruts are likely to be disconnected from the season because calories are so plentiful. But they are then potentially triggered by stress eating, holiday binges, or religious feast days. And the inverse may also be true. If on the one hand, plentiful nutrition is a trigger for rut, then your poor alphas might choose to starve themselves at the first sign of rut that they don't want to go through in order to prevent or short-circuit it. It is up to you as an author how successful that's likely to be. Crash dieting cycles with that famine and feast sort of pattern, they're not great for anybody, but they're likely to cause havoc with the timing of a rut. And if this is the case, again, there is almost certainly some sort of hippy-dippy new age, clean-eating, anti-horny diet that con artists insist on promoting for money. A third potential trigger for rut would be the reverse of the ram effect. In Our Friends the Sheep, there is a fairly well-studied phenomenon where if you deprive a bunch of ewes of rams, so they can't see, hear, or smell them for a while, and then reintroduce them to the company of rams, you can induce them to cycle early. This is due to the ram's pheromones and basically tricking the ewes into believing there's a worldwide shortage of rams and they'd better take advantage of this now by cycling early if they're ever going to get some. There's no reason your pheromone-addled characters can't also be subject to a similar effect. And it does mean that if your alphas and your omegas have been deliberately and effectively avoiding each other for a long period of time in order to avoid feeling horny, that's going to backfire spectacularly when they do eventually meet, for literary reasons. And if your alphas and your omegas have been avoiding each other's company, presumably they've been hanging out with betas. So let's talk briefly about those. Now, admittedly, you're probably not watching this video for an overview of beta anatomy. And I will tend to call it beta rather than beta because beta sounds like the fish. Betas, if present in the world, are usually considered to be like default cis men and women in our universe with the most common anatomical arrangements. You could find one just like them at any local grocery store. They are assumed to be present in a lot of the world building. Presumably somebody has to keep society running while all the omegas are in heat, after all. I just wonder what the betas feel about all this. The implication is that they're living quite ordinary lives while the alphas and the omegas are doing their thing. So what's their impression of all these shenanigans? I also have to wonder whether betas detect or are aware of alpha and omega pheromones in any way, whether they detect them as an odor or they're just purely oblivious, like the way we are to many other animal pheromones. And at the same time, do betas produce pheromones of their own? Because we all probably do, let's be honest. Do alphas and omegas detect beta pheromones? Do beta pheromones just signal unavailable or undesirable or neutral? Are they a turn-off, delaying positive feedback loops? Or are they just diluting out the more interesting pheromones? In a biased bioessentialist world, are betas preferentially selected for things like diplomatic positions, as they are significantly less likely to cause an international incident with their genitals? They may also be preferred for roles that deal with a lot of people, so that those pesky pheromones aren't going to be a problem. But either way, it's generally inferred that betas are working away in the background somewhere, which is why Omegaverse is sometimes called ABO. And as a side note, I think Omegaverse is the much cooler word, but if you do want to call it ABO, do make sure you say it that way and always write it with a slash between the letters, because otherwise if you pronounce this as just one word, one three-letter word, it's a slur for Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And that's not what this is about at all. It's not polite, it's going to attract the wrong audience, and it's going to confuse the heck out of any AI scraping your work. So if you want diagrams or physiological explanations for betas as being the same as a default cis human in our universe, there's plenty of resources on websites and books still available in most countries. But we are finally moving on to talk about our options for your omegas and how to get these gentlemen pregnant. Finally, we start discussing omegas, the most distinctive feature of Omegaverse. And you are presumably still here because you want to know how to get these dudes pregnant. Indeed, how is Babby formed? Well, ladies, babies, and gentlemen, you have options. Given that Omegaverse is entirely fictional biology that just borrows concepts from the real world, there are actually multiple different methods you could use for your omega pregnancies. I'm just going to go over some of the more commonly suggested methods that I've seen across the internet, or go through some other plausible biology that I think plausibly fits the tropes of Omegaverse. So with that in mind, let's start with some of the more consistently present features of omegas, starting with the heat. Going into heat, or estrus, if you want the technical term, is a reproductive event characterized by being at the peak of fertility and the behavioral changes associated with that. The word estrus is derived from a Greek origin, which means frenzy, which might give you an idea of what those behaviors could be like. Humans in this universe are said to have a menstrual cycle rather than a heat cycle, which means our cycles are defined by the bleeding phase we have every 4 to 6 weeks, where we are generally less fertile and less receptive to reproductive behaviors. We do have a phase where we are more fertile and receptive to reproductive behaviors. That is how all these little humans keep popping up. But our behavior changes are very subtle and muted compared to what happens on our periods. This is probably an evolutionary result of our species using copulation as a recreational and social event. So we want to encourage it through our whole cycle, not just our fertility window. But despite the technical terms, they are functionally the same cycle, where estrus is the peak of fertility and menstruation is the trough. Whether your omegas menstruate or not depends upon their anatomy, because not all species do. What I am saying there is that you can give your omegas both a heat cycle and menstrual cycle if you want them to have both of those experiences. They just occur either at opposite ends of the cycle, if your omegas cycle continuously, or potentially a couple of weeks later if they only cycle once or twice a year. But they don't really have a heat cycle and a menstrual cycle. It's really just one cycle with two events in it, even if they have two sets of organs. This is because hormones don't just go to one target. They can diffuse all around the body, which means reproductive hormones will affect all the reproductive tissues present in that body. And because of positive or negative feedback loops, whichever set of signals is stronger is going to override the others. So what happens during a heat? Well, the physiological and behavioral changes that happen are geared towards getting that creature mated. Some species will have display behaviors or changes in their appearance, like our acquaintance the baboon does with their distinctive derriere swelling. And as a general rule, creatures in heat will find the corresponding behaviors in their partners, such as males in rut, to be more interesting and alluring and attractive. which means that whatever display behaviors you've decided your alphas exhibit as they come into rut will become progressively more charming to your omegas as they come into heat. Even if, like goats, you've decided alphas in rut pee on their feet. Now, some species will come into heat once a year or a couple of times across a short season. Other species will come into heat all year round or a couple of times spread across the year. How often your omegas come into heat will depend on your world building and what suits your plot. But if your world has a breeding season, then it also has a birthing season, and there will most certainly be memes about this. It will also make the horoscopes really kind of weird. And really, there's probably actually 2 breeding seasons, one for the Northern Hemisphere and one for the Southern Hemisphere, because those seasonal cues will be flipped and opposite each other. And that opens up a whole can of worms about breeding tourism, because an opportunistic alpha might jump hemispheres every 6 months in order to follow the omega population which is now coming into heat. We actually do something similar with thoroughbred horses in the racing industry, where very expensive stallions are flown from the Northern Hemisphere to the Southern Hemisphere every year in order to capitalize upon both breeding seasons. For literary purposes, international travel may also cause havoc with an individual omega's reproductive cycles, and who knows what happens once a population achieves space travel. Like a rut, a heat could be stimulated by changing daylight lengths or by increased levels of nutrition. So artificial lights or suddenly increasing the amount of food eaten for a week or so could potentially induce a heat. And as the consequences of a seasonally breeding society were largely discussed under the alpha's ruts, I don't think I need to go over all the same points again. After all, it does take 2 to tango. But broadly speaking, there are 2 types of estrus you could consider for your omegas. Most animals in estrus, like humans, will ovulate whenever they're ready, regardless of whether they're mated or not, which occurs with this LH surge. But induced ovulators, like our friends the ferrets, will remain on heat until they ovulate, and they will only ovulate when induced by being mated, or given drugs to achieve the same effect, or receive adequate manual stimulation. Traditionally, vasectomized ferrets were used to solve this problem in that species. But humans are a tool-using species. Persistent heats are a major issue for ferrets, because if that ferret stays on heat for an extended period of time, her rising estrogen levels can actually cause bone marrow suppression, which will kill her. So that could be a biological model for death due to not getting any, also known as fuck or die. If you're using the trope that omegas must be mated or they will die, understand that estrogen toxicity is not a rapid death. It's a slow, fading, wasting death as the blood eventually runs out of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. This takes weeks or months to occur. It's quite a leisurely cause of death, actually. Being mated would not cause them to instantly recover. Recovery is also going to take weeks, although a blood transfusion would probably make them feel better very quickly. Bone marrow suppression means that the omega is no longer producing red blood cells, white blood cells, or platelets. A lack of red blood cells is anemia, so they will be fatiguing easy and tired and pale all the time and won't be able to do terribly much in the way of exercise. A low white cell count will predispose them to all sorts of infections and fevers. And a low platelet count means that their blood doesn't clot properly, which can present as spontaneous bruising or as bleeding, particularly from areas like the nose or from the gum. But if you want a more dramatic and urgent problem that requires an omega to get mated to solve it as soon as possible, consider the equivalent of an ovarian cyst. Whatever gonad you've decided your omegas have, it may have a cyst on it, which contains the relevant gamete. And in order for that cyst to rupture and release the gamete, it may require mating beforehand. And if that omega is not mated, that cyst may just continue to grow and grow and grow. We, very lucky humans, can develop ovarian cysts where the follicle that contains our egg has not ruptured, and they get really, really painful. They are often initially mistaken for appendicitis. Experiencing that level of pain is something your omegas probably urgently want resolved and could explain their desperate need to copulate. But preceding that, if you have a cyst slowly growing on your gonad as part of your normal cycle, and you know what's coming because it's not your first cycle, and you're reasonably self-aware, you know what's coming if you don't get that to rupture. And pain is a very potent motivator. So you would reasonably expect increasing levels of desperation as the heat progresses for that omega to get mated, which is all kinds of morally grey about consent and desire in this bioessentialist society, and wiser scholars than I can dive into that. So how might we, or your omega characters, go about trying to suppress a heat or cut short a heat? Modern medicine is a true miracle when it comes to reproductive choice. And as a society, we're actually pretty good at manipulating the reproductive cycles of both ourselves and of our domestic species, whether that's inducing a heat or enhancing fertility, or actually cutting it off. Between delaying or inducing cycles for IVF or preventing ovulation for conception, modern medicine gives us options for most mammalian species, and some birds and even some fish. Some of those options look like taking a pill every day, like a progesterone-based pill. The downside of that is that your omega has to actually remember to take the pill, and having any sort of gastro could sabotage that. Plus, hormones do have side effects, but in Omegaverse, the side effects of the hormonal pill might be less maddening than the actual heat cycle. Subcutaneous implants are a longer-term solution, and they are hard to remove, but they could vary in terms of how long it takes them to kick in or wear off. Uterine implants, like IUDs, only work if your omega has a uterus. A rectal implant is not going to work because it will be pushed out regularly. And please note, our modern IUDs, even the ones with hormones in them, they don't actually stop the whole cycle. They just provide contraception. So they stop any embryos from implanting to cause a pregnancy. And some of them will be able to reduce the amount of bleeding that you get at the period end. But the whole hormone cycle and everything that happens to the brain still happens. So even with an IUD or equivalent, your omega will still have the behavioral changes associated with being on heat. And very broadly speaking, some types of hormonal contraceptives mimic pregnancy so that ovulation does not occur. Some will bind to specific hormones to interfere with the process, and some will just prevent implantation. Surgical contraceptive solutions come in two types: removing the gonads, which will prevent all the cycling as well as pregnancy, although technically surrogacy could be achieved with modern technology and hormone supplements, or removing the uterus or tying the relevant tubes, which means all the hormone cycles still happen, but the gametes cannot get to the implantation sites to achieve a pregnancy. And if your omegas are induced ovulators, modern medicine could provide them with injections that they can take to end a heat early, but it does mean the next heat will come around sooner than expected most of the time, which might make planning a little bit hard, and they could very easily get the timing wrong for literary purposes. For induced ovulators, suitably vigorous manual stimulation could trick the body into thinking it's been mated and thus end the heat. While omegas could do it the old-fashioned ferret way by borrowing a vasectomized alpha for their heat, there is probably also a thriving business for toys. An omega's heat is quite a serious event, after all. It is the topic of a vast number of literary works. And practically, people in an Omegaverse society might talk about such objects very openly, with a wide variety of customization options available, because such toys become potentially life-saving devices. On the less convenient end, given that the purpose of being on heat is ultimately to get pregnant, being sick or in poor health could potentially stop a heat cycle. Acute or severe starvation is known to stop menstrual cycles and reproductive cycles in other species, but other severe illnesses could possibly do it as well. Extreme exercise can also stop a reproductive cycle. So, in the absence of our glorious modern medicine, home remedies to end a heat like starvation, artificial fever, or extreme exercise might still work, but they're probably going to make your omega feel very unwell. Herbal remedies are likely to be less effective than modern medicine would be, but sometimes that's all you've got. They may also have more side effects than modern medicine would have. And those herbal side effects could be as benign as mammary hyperplasia or as sinister as liver failure. Take your pick for world building purposes. The other frequently noted feature of omegas, particularly male omegas, is the production of slick. Slick, if you didn't know, and I apologise if this is news to you, is a convenient literary device which allows a male omega to have a self-lubricating rectum in order to be ready for action at a moment's notice. And sure, makes sense for a reproductive tract to lubricate itself in order to minimize damage and other abrasions. But what is slick really? Now, some of you will be envisioning the copious slime produced by our friends the hagfish. And that is certainly an inspiring amount of slippery proteins. But you need to understand the hagfish secretes a relatively small amount of slime. It just expands to 10 times its volume when exposed to water. And our friend the hagfish is basically always in water. Omegas are generally not spending all of their time in water, and omega slick isn't a defense mechanism the same way hagfish slime is. So the omegas do not need to produce as much slick as a hagfish does slime. And if you're going to say, well, maybe omega slick expands when it's exposed to air, then first of all, there should not be that much air inside an omega's rectum or reproductive tract. Secondly, it would make flatulence an extremely upsetting experience. And thirdly, it would probably become some kind of fluffy when exposed to air, and slick should not be fluffy. Anyway, if your omegas are secreting huge volumes of fluid, you probably don't want them to secrete more than what they could reasonably drink in a day. Otherwise, they're just going to get dehydrated. About a litre per day maximum of slick seems adequate. You can do quite a lot with a litre of lube, though this would suggest that another symptom of an omega being in heat would be becoming extremely thirsty. To be plausible, slick would need to be made up of a number of compounds. Pheromones, obviously, antibacterial compounds, given the usual location it's described as coming from, fluid, and lubricating proteins. Though water is not the only thing the omega is losing in slick. They would also want to consume salts to maintain a proper electrolyte balance, and proteins to replace the protein that they are secreting. Beef nachos seems like it's got all the nutritional components an omega would be craving. Remember, self-care is important. So where does slick come from? Yes, I know the general location, but I mean the structures. You, as the author, get to decide whether slick is produced by secretory mucosa which lines the inside of the fun tunnel of choice, or whether it's produced by a gland which is closely associated with that region. Personally, I think secretory mucosa makes the most sense, either in one continuous ring around the circumference of the relevant receptacle or in various patches lining the wall. Now, I understand the running joke is that omegas secrete so much slick while in heat that they keep falling off chairs when they sit down. That is not practical and is possibly a sign of illness. There are actually plenty of viruses that increase
the fluid and mucus secretion of various organs in the body. You yourself have experienced this anytime you've had a runny nose that just would not stop. It's quite plausible that Omegaverse has its own equivalent for downstairs secretions. And this is probably really frustrating to Omegas. What are they going to do about it? Do they have sanitary products to prevent soaking their trousers? To prevent them from rolling over in bed and slipping out the side? To stop them leaving damp butt prints on everything they sit on? How well understood is Omega reproductive health? Has it got parallels with women's reproductive health in our universe? I leave that question in your capable world-building hands. On a slightly less messy topic, Omegas are said to nest around the time of heat in order to prepare for pregnancy. But given that pregnancy in a humanoid typically takes many months, and judging by the vigorous activities described in the available literature, I think Omegas might actually be nesting at the time of heat in order to prepare their own aftercare. Fun fact is that humans do also exhibit nesting behaviours in late pregnancy. Sometimes it's as simple as organising the onesies and getting a little bit clucky. And sometimes it's spontaneously feeling the need to clean the curtains or deep clean the bathroom tiles or something that you wouldn't usually do. And many people experience behavioural changes with hormonal cycles. For those of us with particularly uncomfortable periods, we often learn to pre-stock our pantries with comfort food and objects like chocolate. Omega's nesting behaviours at the time of heat might just be a version of that, particularly if they're subconsciously expecting to be absolutely wrecked after being railed by an alpha for 4 continuous days. And if that's the case, Omegas would probably exhibit a second set of nesting behaviour as their pregnancy reaches its final few weeks. And speaking of pregnancy, presumably these Omegaverse characters are still classified as mammals, which means that if they get pregnant, the default is that that species breastfeeds. We do produce very dependent, helpless infants. Somebody has to be making the milk for them. Although almost 5% of people polled on my blog believe that male Omegas give birth involving eggs somehow. So I guess that would make them monotremes. The monotreme group being known for including the only living venomous mammal. But if you thought the topic was cringy and uncomfortable before, it's about to get worse. So the purpose of discussing different models for male Omega pregnancy is to give you different options that don't result in death without surgical intervention. That doesn't necessarily mean that I recommend or condone one model over the other, just that you have options. But I don't personally recommend egg laying as your Omega male pregnancy solution. I just don't think it suits the vibe for what we're looking for, but you can make your own choices. And yes, I have seen that one unique TikTok where the Omega male loses all his teeth and the egg comes up out of his mouth. Normally an egg would come out more or less the direction it got fertilized in, and that's all I'm going to say about that one. Egg-laying species generally have a cloaca, which means instead of having a separate anus and opening to the reproductive tract, it's all one hole. Some of them will also have their urinary tract drain into the same area as well, but I assume you want your Omega males to have a functioning phallus at the front. There isn't a womb as such, but a long oviduct down which the egg develops and has more layers of yolk and albumin and shell laid on before it actually gets laid. Most bird species only have one ovary, while most reptile species have 2. The benefits of having only one ovary means that twins are going to be much less common, which is a big advantage when you have relatively large offspring like humanoids do, because trying to lay 2 eggs at the same time is not a good idea. The offspring developing within the egg could have a yolk sac which is external to their body that they grow next to and slowly absorb, or a yolk sac which is internal, that the embryo actually grows around so the yolk sac is on the inside. Now, unless you're writing some very detailed obstetrics or pediatrics in your literature, this isn't going to matter too much, other than the fact that belly buttons from this system will either be absent or barely there at all. Now, laying eggs instead of gestating a fetus in a uterus means that these omegas don't have periods, but they will probably look really bloated around the time of heat because all that yolk, it takes up space. And it's also very nutritionally intensive. So I expect omegas in heat are definitely going to get the munchies. Usually, a single egg cell gets released into the oviduct and very slowly makes its way down, adding layers of yolk and then albumin and then shell before it reaches its final destination. In a species like the chicken, that might just take one day, but it's still very energy intensive and it requires a lot of protein and a lot of calcium. Your humanoid omegas are laying an egg which is much bigger, so it's perfectly fine for them to take much longer for this process. And also note there is a certain fandom which may visit the topic of cannibalism from time to time. And I feel they need to be made aware that unlaid eggs are a delicacy in some cultures. Unlaid eggs are the partially developed yolks, which are still present in the oviduct of a bird, usually a chicken, when it is butchered. They have not yet been laid. Do with that information what you will, considering that this model of omega will have an unlaid egg in their abdomen shortly after being on heat. And also hello to the script family. When it comes to laying that egg, the production of slick would actually be really useful for this situation as well. When it comes to bringing new life into the world, more lube is good lube. But it would also be helpful for evacuating any rectal contents that are still present in the cloaca. And there's no reason your omegas have to lay eggs with a hard shell. Their eggs could have a softer, leathery shell instead. At least that cuts down on the amount of calcium the omega has to put out. And if you've decided to use eggs, you could do a literal seahorse thing with female alphas depositing eggs into male omegas. If you want to, you just alter the gestation length to make it suit your plot. But what about the female omega with this system? Does she lay eggs as well? Does she have a placental womb? Does she have both? Where does her oviduct connect to? Can she both have a placental pregnancy and lay an egg? What determines which one she's going to do? Is it personal preference? Does she have both a cloaca and a vagina? Does she get to both lay eggs and experience periods? And if a female omega, lucky soul, can do both, that means offspring from her placental womb will have a belly button, while those from eggs she has laid do not. And if you decide that female omegas only have a womb and male omegas only have an oviduct, that means that you can tell what somebody's gestational parent was based on whether or not they have a belly button. If a female omega can both carry a pregnancy and lay eggs, you need to decide whether she's capable of doing that at the same time, because that becomes a very crowded abdomen with quite a lot going on. And if she has both, does she have one type of gonad or two? How do you prevent yolk from getting into the uterus where it's almost certainly going to cause a horrific infection and the weirdest period ever as a best case scenario? If a yolk gets into the abdomen, it can easily cause a yolk peritonitis, which is a major medical concern, and nobody really wants to go there. Speaking of crowded abdomens, it's much more common to see omega males be given an entire additional reproductive tract of some sort. One arrangement I've seen suggested involves giving the omega male an entire traditional female reproductive tract. That includes internal gonads, a complete womb, and the whole cervix, vagina, vulva setup, positioned immediately behind the relatively modest, by Omegaverse standards, phallus. This is somewhat similar to the alpha female anatomy one could choose for their Omegaverse, with a couple of exceptions. The first being that the Omega male will have external gonads if you're expecting them to have balls, and the second being that that phallus is hanging on the outside basically all of the time. This is starting to look a little bit like a metidoplasty, which is a type of bottom surgery that some trans men pursue. So just be courteous about people's real world experiences. And compared to the anatomy that might result after a metidoplasty, you will want to adjust the depth of the vagina so that it can adequately accommodate the alpha phallus. And I should make it clear, this style of Omega does not have a self-lubricating rectum. He has a vagina to do that job, and he would not get pregnant via anal copulation. It would be plain old PIV to get that job done. He may also get to experience periods like the rest of us. He can also be identified at birth or while still in the womb if ultrasound technology exists. So if there's very severe prejudice against Omega males, he might meet a terrible fate long before he can do anything about it. But either way, his Omega status is not a surprise that happens at puberty. Everybody already knows. But female Omegas with that system would not be terribly much different from the betas. Their vaginal depth might be a little bit greater, and they might produce more arousal fluid than their beta counterparts, but otherwise they're not detectable or distinguishable, other than pheromones, of course. So they may be able to pass the Omega trait onto their offspring undetected. A different way to grant your male Omegas a secret womb is to give them a complete and otherwise normal womb, which is accessed via the rectum. To make this work, there needs to be a flap of tissue or two, which acts as a valve. That means things coming up will get diverted to where they need to go, and things coming down will push the valve shut so they come out the normal way. This way, when poop is coming down the colon, it's going to close off the flap to the cervix, and when something comes up the colon, which is usually an alpha body part, it's going to be diverted towards the cervix. This is not exactly to scale because I am not an artiste. You may also decide that during heat, there is a swelling at the base of the flap, about there, which makes diverting in the correct direction more likely. Giving your male Omegas this sort of anatomy means that their reproduction functions pretty similar to the default human one, and that they probably do have periods. However, their period is going to come out the rectum, which means there is a sphincter that can probably hold it shut most of the time, which means instead of dripping an uncontrollable amount of blood and uterine lining, they just poop theirs out. There's a couple of potential benefits to having a period, believe it or not. In the Omega male situation in particular, it's right next door to an area with a large amount of bacterial contamination. So if they got a bacterial infection in the uterus, instead of spending a whole lot of energy trying to fight it off, when they have a period, they're doing the biological equivalent of just opening the airlock and dumping it all into space. Because there is a placenta involved in that womb, offspring from these Omegas will in fact have belly buttons. And because the secret womb is technically detectable at birth with careful palpation or with ultrasound if you have that technology, if Omega males are severely prejudiced against, infanticide or abortions could occur. But either way, the Omega status is not going to be a surprise that appears at puberty. If you're using this system, then it's the alpha males and female Omegas which are not detectable at birth, and so can pass the alpha or Omega genes through the population. Unless you've decided to give your female Omegas an additional secret womb accessed via their anus as well. It's possible, although obviously very rare, for a human to have 2 uteri, and it would be technically possible, but very uncomfortable for her to get pregnant in both of those, either at the same time or slightly out of sync. It might also open up some interesting infertility treatments, although both uteri are likely to be at the same stage of their cycle because they're exposed to the same level of hormones. Oh, and if using an IUD for contraception, she will need 2 of them. For whatever sex, if they have a womb which is accessed via their cloaca, it's reasonable to expect that being on heat might slow down their digestion and they may lose part of their appetite. The less they're eating, the less gut contents is passing through that area of interest while they're being railed for 4 days. The diverting flap or valve may swell when the omega is in heat, making it a little bit harder for them to pass gut contents. And of course, the increased slick production will help empty out the region to free up that cloaca for its auxiliary purpose. Slick at this junction has 2 purposes. The first is to physically make the walls too slippery for bacteria to colonize, and the second is, of course, to lubricate for the alpha's visit. So while the volume of slick will increase with the stimulation from an alpha, there will be a baseline production that's also happening in order to prevent microorganisms from going up the wrong way. And that first phase of heat, where the slick production suddenly increases, may rapidly evacuate anything that was already sitting in the rectum and could potentially be mistaken for gastro. Alternatively, if you've decided that your omega males are only receptive to an alpha when in heat, you might decide that they have a sphincter rather than a flap at the top of their cloaca, which will swell when in heat and actually closes with arousal, so that there's only one way for their alpha visitor to go. You could go further and say that the sphincter at the top of the cloaca will only close when there is enough swelling at the entrance, i.e., the presence of the knot, which is starting to get a bit literal about getting his guts rearranged. And since slick contains a whole bunch of pheromones and it is mixing with gut contents, unfortunately, flatulence is probably a significant event for signaling cycle status and fertility. And if you are wondering, sometimes I am not thrilled about the conclusions I am drawing in this video. But maybe you think that is all too complicated, and fair enough. Maybe you just really like our friend the hyena and want to convert their female anatomy to male omegas. Now, I've discussed female hyena anatomy under the alpha female segment. They essentially have a very large clitoris which functions as a penis, which they urinate through and get pregnant through and give birth through. This takes a lot of delicate positioning on behalf of the male hyena. Now, if you just copy and paste the female hyena arrangement onto your male omegas, you might bring up the debate about whether male omegas are technically female or not, especially if you decide that they can only get pregnant, they can't get another person pregnant. Male omegas would then get pregnant via some sort of frotting activity. So I would have to question, why is slick so important in that system? And then I would have to question whether you really want your male omegas to give birth through their phallus like hyenas do. Because hyena pups have a roughly 60% mortality rate just being born because of their complicated birth canal. And I don't know about you, but I read fiction for fun. And the high likelihood of dead babies for me would be not fun. To tweak it very slightly, you could say male omegas are capable of impregnating most of the time, except when they're on heat, which is when they become receptive, and perhaps say they do have a dormant or a tretesic birth canal, which will open once they are actually pregnant in order to avoid the stillbirth risks. I mean, technically the hyena arrangement works, but for me it carries an unacceptably high risk of both offspring and maternal mortality. But then again, maybe you're here because you like nulls and not just a pure Omegaverse setting. But lastly, please allow me to suggest a version of anatomy which is a little more unhinged. Because as far as I can tell, Your ideal male omega anatomy situation has them produce a huge amount of slick, get pregnant up the butt, be indistinguishable from other male genders up until presentation, and have the potential to become a trans omega but still fertile. So while I assumed such topics would exist somewhere in Omegaverse, given that the setting plays so heavily with gender, I came across a subset of fiction where male alphas are usually forcefully transitioned into omegas, functional omegas, and that was termed bitching. So if you want to incorporate all of these tropes, you could consider this colonic diverticulum model. But before we get into the guts of the situation, allow me to introduce you to our friend, the Suriname toad. You may have seen clips of these little ladies before, and if you are at all squeamish about little wiggly things coming out of holes on skin, you might want to look away for just a moment, because this is the toad that raises its tadpoles on the skin of its back. Female Suriname toads develop puffy skin on their back before laying their eggs and then transferring the eggs onto that puffy skin, where they embed and are incubated until they eventually crawl out as froglets. So just keep that concept in mind. Usually creatures carry a pregnancy pretty close to where they get impregnated. So if your male omegas are getting impregnated up the butt, we need to give them a pregnancy round about that area. So let's give them a colonic diverticulum to receive it. A colonic diverticulum is just a pouch, just a little pocket that develops in the colon wall. Real humans develop this every now and then as part of pathology, so it's perfectly doable. But let's say these develop according to plan in male omegas, perhaps only appearing when they're on heat. It does need to be positioned relatively high up the colon, partly to avoid interfering with the regular male anatomy down below, but also so that it is only reachable by a generously proportioned alpha phallus. I also recommend positioning it on the anterior wall, which is towards the front, in order to minimize gut disturbances later in pregnancy, as well as minimize the back pain. Now, let's say this diverticulum has mucosa, which is the normal lining of the gut, that becomes thicker and spongy and nutrient rich, rather like the lining of a uterus when the omega is in heat. Spongy tissue often oozes fluid very easily, so the presence of that spongy layer would definitely change the pheromones and the scent coming out of the slick. Slick, as previously discussed, is being produced by either glands or the mucosa of the colon, so the two secretions are in proximity and can mix. Now, the colon is very obviously full of bacteria and poop, so one of the functions of slick is to make it all slippery so that that all slides on out, and that any bacteria trying to colonize the wall just finds the surface too slippery. It's just being washed away. It's kind of like fish trying to swim up a very fast flowing river. A few specialized species could do it, but most of the hangers on are just going to be washed out. But producing large quantities of slick to wash away bacteria means that any gametes are also going to be washed away unless they're deposited very, very closely to that diverticulum. Hence the alpha's notorious length. And I suppose it would increase their chances of fertilization if everything could just stay in place a little bit longer, so that those gametes have a chance to move into the spongy layer, burrow in and adhere, especially if you've chosen to use amoeboid gametes. And this is a potential function of the knot, keeping the couple tied in very close proximity while gametes are doing their thing. Now, the omega's gametes also needs to reach that diverticulum. You could say that omegas have a set of internal gonads, but then those omegas would be detectable via ultrasound from birth. If you want their omega status to be truly a surprise, they need a set of dangly testicles like everybody else. But the vas deferens, which is the tube that carries sperm into the rest of the tract, does travel close enough to the colon that you could say that it reaches the diverticulum, or perhaps it extends a little bit during heat. Maybe part of the vas deferens fuses with the wall of the colonic diverticulum, which would mean it's in the same place every single time. Or perhaps male omegas always had a separate tube to get their gametes up to their colon. If it is very, very fine, so less than a millimeter, it would be exceedingly difficult to find that on ultrasound, especially on a prenatal ultrasound. Or perhaps the vas deferens fuses with the colon wall in heat. It's a little bit of a stretch, but the body does stranger things. Having gonads only in the scrotum means that both partners need to get their gametes up to the colonic diverticulum where pregnancy will be maintained, which means both partners need to ejaculate. Modern equality. This does mean that substituting an alpha for a turkey baster will be a bit more awkward, but people who are determined to have children will often do whatever invasive procedure it takes. Once both sets of gametes are deposited into that spongy layer in the diverticulum, the alphas coming from the lining of the colon and the omegas coming from the vas deferens where it enters the colon wall, both gametes need to burrow in through the spongy layer so that they can meet and merge. This is another reason why I would consider amoeboid gametes, as mentioned much earlier in the video. Now, once those two sets of gametes have merged in the diverticulum, that spongy layer, or indeed the whole diverticulum, will need to be walled off. A pseudomembrane would do. The colon is already able to produce pseudomembranes, usually to wall off damaged tissue. They're made up of inflammatory proteins rather than cells, so it's perfectly reasonable to suggest that it walls off the diverticulum this way. Combine that with a consistent volume of slick to wash away bacterial contamination, and we've got a decent little pocket for our developing embryo. Now, if a pregnancy does not occur, the spongy lining in that diverticulum is most likely going to be shed. It's probably more energy efficient and lower risk to just dump the whole lining rather than trying to reabsorb it and risk contamination. This is what humans do when we have a period, but because this is happening in the colon, these omegas can essentially hold in their period until they poop. On the other hand, if that pregnancy takes, the embryo is going to need more space. Fortunately, an embryo grows relatively slowly, so there is time for that omega's diverticulum to expand around it. That diverticulum will need to maintain a spongy layer to nurture the embryo via the placenta, but the colon wall is also going to need to thicken its muscle layer in order to eventually push the offspring out. The colon already has a couple of thin layers of muscle within it. Now it's just got 9 months to thicken up that muscle for delivery. It's fine, weirder things have happened over the course of a pregnancy. The pseudomembrane will need to be maintained in order to keep the fetus away from the poop in the rest of the colon. In late pregnancy, this may impede on the diameter of the colon a little bit. So the digestive function starts to get a bit squished. Omega males would need to make sure they're eating enough fiber and fluids in order to poop properly. And as such, vegetable soup is probably a traditional pregnancy meal. Oh, and the location of that diverticulum is going to need to be high enough in the colon that the pregnancy is sitting in the abdomen and not the pelvic canal until it is time to give birth and everything kind of sinks and drops. Offspring would be birthed via the rectum, and slick is probably jolly useful at this junction. It is going to be a bit of a stretch, but probably not that much worse than a default pregnancy. Now, some of the social consequences of the colonic diverticulum model is that omegas are not detectable before the first heat. Even the omega doesn't know they are an omega until they present. They are not detectable via ultrasound or in infancy because alpha, beta, and omega males will have exactly the same anatomy before puberty, which means that if you wanted to induce omega status in an alpha or a beta, you could do it just with medical influence like hormones, and they would still be functional and be able to carry a pregnancy. Now, as a world building question, I would also ask whether omega females can carry a colonic pregnancy, because that opens up a whole bunch of different infertility treatments as well. But it also means beta and omega females are indistinguishable from each other as well. And because everybody gets a placenta, everybody has normal belly buttons. Is this getting a bit weird? Yes, but it is based upon a real life toad and a couple of things that your human body can do in sickness anyway. Honestly, it's not any weirder than the rest of the video. But whichever sets of anatomy you choose to implement for your alphas and omegas, there's one more world building question I'd urge you to consider. Is it an evolved system, or did ABO develop some other way? Because reproduction is complicated at the best of times, and having 6 different phenotypes makes it even worse. So it's probably not a recently evolved system. For evolution to happen, it requires reproduction to happen efficiently. So if the systems discussed in this video did evolve, they probably evolved quite a long way back in the past. And the longer ago they evolved, the further back down the evolutionary tree they developed, the more related species will share that trait. What this means is that if humans evolved with an alpha, beta, omega reproductive system, then our closest relatives, bonobos and chimpanzees, probably did as well. And the concept of an alpha male chimpanzee is a little bit terrifying. But the more refined that system, the longer ago it evolved, the more groups are likely to share that reproductive system. So I think it's quite likely that mammals in general would also reproduce with an alpha, beta, omega system. And it's plausible that all the chordates, the things with a backbone, and potentially all of Animalia reproduce that way as well. It's probably not going to be all multicellular organisms though, because honestly, plants and fungi have always kind of done their own thing anyway. So what does that mean for your world building? Well, firstly, it means our domestic pets, like dogs and cats, and domestically farmed species like cattle also exist as alphas, betas, and omegas. And that raises the issue of population control, because now 2/3 of the species can get pregnant, not just half of them. But it might also raise some behavioural concerns. If alphas are characterised as being more aggressive than normal, would farmers avoid keeping alpha male bulls? And would some steers still run the risk of potentially getting pregnant, because that poses an animal welfare issue at slaughtering time? Do hunters need to be extra cautious? Running into a moose with a calf does not seem like a fun time, but is that a lot worse if that moose is an alpha female? What are the implications for endangered species conservation? Would the humpback whale population rebound quicker because now some of the males are also capable of rearing calves? Would we still surgically neuter our domestic species for population control? How complicated is that now? And does it even work? Or alternatively, if Omegaverse is unique to humans, why? Are you going to drink the creationist Kool-Aid and just say, well, we were created that way by a wise and all-knowing creator? Or are you writing in a science fiction setting and some other species has been accidentally fused with humans, perhaps in a teleportation accident or something? Does this perhaps merge 2 individuals together, creating a blend of smushed up anatomy that is a bit weird and unfamiliar, but luckily still functional? Is the ABO system actually some kind of DNA parasite, which is naturalized into the population, meaning that alphas and omegas are infected, but betas are not? Saculina is a fascinating species of parasitic barnacle which targets crabs. The Saculina basically replaces the crab's genitals with itself, co-opting the crab's biology and feminizing their hormones and tricking that crab into releasing the Saculina's offspring instead of its own. And Saculina can even pull this little magic trick with male crabs, feminizing them to achieve exactly the same result. Now, crabs are very different to humans, obviously, because they release their offspring into the water as hatchlings, but humans nurture their offspring internally and then get really quite emotionally invested in that offspring. So if humans had been contaminated with a DNA parasite, which has integrated itself into our DNA, producing some people which are alphas or omegas, you can't effectively remove that parasite from the person. It would severely alter them at best, and probably kill them at worst. So what do you do about it? Do you just let those people live because the alternative is murder? Over time, those alphas and omegas would naturalize into the population, but still potentially face a bunch of prejudice because they're abnormal or contaminated in some way. And yet, society may actually reward some features of the male alpha or the female omega, which means over many generations, they essentially become integrated into the original population. If you've stuck with me this far, thank you. I hope you found some of these concepts interesting or useful or perhaps just thought provoking. I'm under no illusions as to why people mostly read Omegaverse stories, and most of those readers will not concern themselves with the details of the anatomy, other than whether part A can fit into whole B, and they're certainly not going to worry about the world building. But there is a small percentage of readers that do contemplate these things, and this video has been mostly for them. Even if you're not particularly stimulated by the topic, watching how other people deconstruct and rearrange gender like Legos is at least a little bit interesting. And now I must thank both of my Ko-fi supporters because while they did not actually ask for this topic, they also didn't stop me. Thank you for watching. This video took me quite a long time to film, and I appreciate you watching it. If you have a speculative biology topic you'd like me to tackle, please drop it into the comments below. My name is Dr. Ferox, and I will see you next time.